Hi, everybody. I'm very happy to be here, and I must say that I am more than, excuse me, hey, Chris, a little intimidated to A, be at Oxford, and B, stand at the lectern where Secretary Clinton gave her keynote when she was introducing Eleanor Roosevelt to the campus. So I appreciate your warm welcome. Thank you.
Sorry.
And I am already a huge fan of your new principal, Helen, and Kate. I would just walk through fire for any day of the week. So I am very grateful to be here. And what I'd like to do is just as Helen said, unpack the stereotypes that surround Eleanor Roosevelt, because the story of Eleanor's evolution as a human rights thinker, as a primary architect of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, is just only being understood. And the reason that story's been hidden, I think, is there are four major reasons. First is that Eleanor refused to tell her own story. She felt like that if she acknowledged the work that she did, the struggles that she had, the arguments that she weighed, that the story became more about her than the Declaration. So in her writings, her voice is absent. The second thing is that Malik and Rene Cassin and John Humphrey had titanic egos, and they fought with each other tooth and nail in an eviscerating fashion after the Declaration was introduced to say, it's really my baby. So she just tried to rise above that. And the third thing is, for all of the historians and the lawyers in here who, like me, demand evidence, the documentary trail was scattered because floods and UN archives destroyed some of the material. Eleanor purged her papers before she gave them to the FDR library. And so the evidentiary record for what I want to talk about today comes from 263 archives in 50 states and 9 nations. And so I hope that Herculean research task that was conducted by my team, my colleagues, and bartered with other human rights scholars around the world will let you see why this woman was brave and bold and worthy to stand in front of the Institute. So once I walk you through this, I trust that you will embrace in your minds and in your hearts the guts that it took for her to do this, why she belongs in Bonavero, and that every day when you are on the Mansfield grounds and you walk past her, that you will stop to breathe in her courage and her joy so that you will continue the battle that she so urges us still today to fight. So since we're in the most prestigious university in the world, and we're talking about a woman who helped lead the negotiations on what I think is the most important document to come out of the world in the last century, I have to point out the first irony is that she only had 4 years of school. I'm not talking college, I'm not talking postdoc, I'm talking a total 4 years of education from when she was 14 to 18. And it happened in London under the extraordinary tutelage of Marie Souvestre. And the school now is basically where the women play the Wimbledon finals. So when you think about Venus and Serena or Billie Jean and Martina, I want you to think of Eleanor engaged in mortal intellectual combat with her great teacher Marie Souvestre, because she taught her the fundamental point that Eleanor understood and applied to negotiate the Declaration. And that was, you never know what you think until you can argue the opinion of your fiercest critic with equal integrity. And so Eleanor would argue both sides of the Boer War when she was in school, When she was here, she would argue, when she was in the final throes of the Paris negotiations in 1948, she and Wyszynski and Gromyko get into an extensive debate over tea about the real intent of Marx. So she had an insatiable curiosity and was totally self-educated. By the time she got to the UN, she could speak 5 languages, and she had read deeply in all the religions of the world to try to come up with common ground. Just to give you an example, in 1939, in the United States, she writes a book called The Moral Basis of Democracy, in which she discusses the democratic values of the Quran. I wonder what would happen if she tried to publish that today in the United States. So this gives her a keen understanding, both intellectually and on a gut level, of why the Declaration is so critical to a post-war world. She understood from her own personal experience the human cost of war. During World War I, she walked battlefields strewn with bodies of soldiers filled with maggots who had not yet been buried, and tried to go through pockets to identify the soldiers so that, in fact, she could contact their family. She walked through the seared Bella Woods, and in the United States, she worked with shell-shocked sailors who were confined in straitjackets, sitting in their own defecation in St. Elizabeth's Hospital. So she saw, in a brutal way, the human consequences of war. And then later she saw how the fears of war and the fears of difference just ripped the United States and the world apart. From the battles over the Versailles Treaty to the League of Nations to the whole concept of return to normalcy. We have to focus on our own economies. We've done our part for the world. We're not going back. That led to prompt and execute a worldwide Great Depression, which she experienced personally more so than any key administrator in the White House. For example, Eleanor traveled once she was First Lady and in office. She traveled so many miles that by Thanksgiving of her first day in the White House, the Washington Post runs a banner headline that says First Lady spends night in White House. She travels without Secret Service protection. She goes all over the country. She drives her own car. She, by the time she leaves the White House, she will have broken mythical taboos for women going into the bottom of mines, where cartoonists come out and they have her face covered in soot. So much so that her increasing understanding of race and her increasing understanding of Jim Crow will prompt her in 1939 to resign from the Daughters of the American Revolution, because it bans the famous African-American contralto, Marian Anderson, from singing in the Lincoln Memorial. Now, why is that important? In American history, it's important because it turns the Lincoln Memorial into a civil rights sanctuary. But it's politically important because it's that impetus, the largest crowd ever gathered in the United States Capitol, which is a multiracial, predominantly African-American crowd, is the impetus for the Fair Employment Practices Commission, which is the first time the federal government will, in fact, issue an executive order banning discrimination in employment based on race. So she also develops a correspondence with the United States. And I just want you to think about this as a way to understand what's happening in the United States. Eleanor Roosevelt in her first year in the White House, receives unsolicited correspondence from Americans that's equal to the unsolicited correspondence that Abraham Lincoln, Woodrow Wilson, and Herbert Hoover have combined. And everyone got an answer. This is pre-internet. It's pre-form letters. They came written literally on scraps of newspaper that were lying in gutters, as well as Crane's fine stationery. She invited people to the White House. She was notorious for dropping in on them. So she got a sense through her travels, through her phone conversations with the American public, through the conversations and letters that she had with the American public about what the American psyche was and how vulnerable it was in the throes of the Great Depression. She also understood in ways that many in the White House did not, on a personal level, the horrors of war. When she is blamed for a race riot in the United States in 1943, she can finally fly to the Pacific to use her nationally syndicated column to celebrate the courage of Allied soldiers in the Pacific the way Ernie Pyle celebrated them in the Atlantic. And that means that she flies an unpressurized military aircraft. Her eardrum in her left ear shatters. She will never be able to hear out of it again. Her first 2 days there, she walks 58 miles of hospital corridors. Her arches begin to fall. She can never really stand without specially made shoes after that. She walks up and down hospital corridors. She holds plasma for doctors in doing triage when in the emergency rooms are too crowded. She's in foxholes, and she does the USO tours. She begins to carry a prayer with her, as Secretary Clinton noted, that says, "Dear Lord, lest I continue in my complacent ways, help me to remember that somewhere someone died for me today. And if there be war, help me to remember to ask and to answer, am I worth dying for?" She tells her great friend Truda Lash that the war fills me with the greatest sense of responsibility that I dread that I will never be able to discharge. So she comes back to the United States and engages in a big debate with FDR. FDR says, say goodbye to Dr. New Deal and hello to Dr. Win the War. An hour and 37 minutes later, Eleanor Roosevelt has her own press conference and says, I, for one, will not put the New Deal away in lavender. And so there is a very public fight between the president and the first lady on what freedom from want and freedom from fear mean. Eleanor becomes very much an influence on his famous Economics Bill of Rights speech, not in the sense of an editor or a phrase, but as someone who was always giving him material to read. And we do know recently that, in fact, Eleanor did review the Economic Bill of Rights speech before he gave it. So she has also been closely working alongside FDR on the vision for the United Nations. And this is the material that we're just now beginning to unpack. We know that she has been integrally involved in the debates over trusteeships and mandates on what the post-war world will look like. In fact, as FDR lay dying suddenly in Warm Springs, Georgia in April of 1945, Eleanor is meeting with Charles Taussig, who was the original brain truster, to develop strategies that Eleanor could use on the cross-country train ride that she and FDR were going to take from D.C. to San Francisco for the founding conference of the UN, on how he could get messages to FDR to circumvent the military and some high members of state who were opposed to FDR's plans for trusteeships. So when he dies suddenly, Eleanor's view of her role begins to change. And she realizes that her first responsibility is to her children and to settle the estate. But as she also tells Harold Ickes, who travels to Hyde Park to encourage her, the family home, to encourage her to run for the Senate or to be Secretary of Labor. She has already turned down offers to head a major one of the most prestigious universities in the United States. And she says, "You need not worry, my voice will not be silent." So the struggle now is for how Eleanor develops her own voice, and how can she do it in a way that does not undercut the new president, Harry Truman. Now, why do I say that? Eleanor Roosevelt in heels was 8 inches taller than Harry Truman. And she is the one who tells the vice president that the president is dead. She's sitting on a sofa. He walks in. She stands up. She puts her hand on his shoulder, and she says, "Harry, the president is dead." And Truman says to her, "Oh, I'm so sorry, Mrs. Roosevelt. Is there anything I can do for you?" And she says, "That's the wrong question. The question is, what can I do for you, because you're the one that's in trouble now." Because she understood that Truman had been left out of major domestic and military planning decisions, and she also, to be honest, had great suspicion of his Missouri colleagues, let's say, who were involved in forms of boss rule that she thought was antithetical to what a president should do. So FDR's death changes her role. And the last night she's in the White House, she writes her beloved confidant, Lorena Hickok, "FDR's death has ended a period in history. And for those of us who live in his shadow, we now must wonder what we can achieve under our own momentum." And so as she goes to Hyde Park, and the San Francisco Conference continues, she stays almost, in daily contact with Edward Stettinius, the Secretary of State, who is giving her back-channel phone calls, sending her memos through intermediaries that come, that in some cases even flying memos from San Francisco to New York, and having somebody, bring the memos up from the city to her to read. And she follows the debates with incredible clarity. We know that she calls NGOs who were there to offer their guidance. We know that she talks with the Philippine delegate, General Carlos Romulo, who is the person who gets human rights inserted into the UN Charter. And we know that she begins to try to develop a network that will work around James Burns, who was Truman's closest person in the White House. So she writes Truman, and as she's continuing her daily newspaper column now too. And so her column begins to talk about what the future of the post-war world will look like as the war winds down. The United States, once the war is over, is terrified of a return to the Great Depression. And Truman, whose leadership becomes very apparent in 48, in early 45, is making fairly clueless decisions What do I mean? He lifts the ban on food prices, the controls on food prices, but keeps the prices down on wages. Or he will lift the prices on wages and also lift the prices on rent. So that there are wildcat strikes across the country. Racial violence escalates. There are 63 race riots in the United States in 1945. 61 of the 63 are white on black. So the country is tense. The best example of this is the Academy Award for that year goes to a film entitled The Best Years of Our Lives, which stars a double amputee war vet, talking about his struggle to marry the woman that he loves when he no longer has arms. Eleanor is quiet during this, but by October, she is incredibly frustrated. She feels that the New Deal has been thrown away, that the leadership that is in the White House doesn't have the gravitas yet to build and hold together a coalition that was even fraying at the end of FDR's presidency. So Eleanor takes it upon herself in a nationwide lecture tour to rally the country. Truman's poll numbers go in the toilet. At this point, we just have the Roper polls, and Gallup is like in its infancy, but his approval ratings are 38%. Let me remind you that 38% is fewer. Is a lower approval rating than George W. Bush had at the end of the Iraq War. It was the lowest approval rate in the history of the United States. And so Truman he knows that he has to get some of that Roosevelt stardust back. And so he goes to Jimmy Burns and he says, what am I going to do with her? And basically Jimmy Burns says, I have the perfect solution, Mr. President. We're going to appoint her to the first American delegation to the United Nations. We'll get her out of the country. She can leave in December, and spend 3 months in Europe. We can get your legislative agenda through, and then she'll be totally pigeonholed, inferring that she would then be pigeonholed as the symbol of FDR's agenda and his beloved widow. Well, it doesn't work that way. In December 31st, 1945, Eleanor Roosevelt carries her own suitcase aboard the Queen Elizabeth. The guys on the delegation, who are former secretaries of state, the sitting secretary of state, the ranking and majority members of the House and the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, all of whom have Ivy League law degrees or have led their graduating class in Texas, are standing there talking about the important work of the Security Council. Eleanor goes up a back gangplank, goes into her room, and begins to read the material that is assembled there. The third day there at sea, she is walking along the deck, and Arthur Vandenberg, a Republican, comes running up to her and says, Mrs. Roosevelt, we have decided that you should be on Committee 3. And her immediate response is, she says to herself, as she writes to other people, was, everybody else got to pick, why don't I? But she bites her tongue and she says, thank you, Senator. Will you make sure that all the appropriate material is sent to my stateroom? Committee 3 is the Committee for Social, Humanitarian, and Cultural Concerns. The male members of the American delegation were focused on who was going to get the veto in the UN Security Council, who was going to get the bomb, how were we going to control atomic energy. Nobody thought about refugees. Nobody thought about displaced persons. Nobody thought about hunger. Nobody thought about cities that had been leveled by ferocious ground and air wars. So the battles began. And the way to really, I think, unpack the battle over the Declaration is to look at this in 4 oversimplified ways. The first is the battle that Eleanor waged within the American delegation on what our role in crafting the Declaration should be and what the Declaration should contain. The second battle is within the Human Rights Commission itself. The third will be within the General Assembly once the Declaration is given to them for final approval. And last, but by no means least, is the battle to sell it at home once it's adopted. So within the delegation, nobody wanted her there. If you look at committee records and correspondence of members of Congress who had to approve her appointment, you see tremendous hesitation and doubt. But yet only one United States Senator votes against her confirmation, and that is Theodore Bilbo, an arch segregationist from the state of Mississippi. They're angry she's there because she's going to get press and they don't. They see her as a mushy-headed symbol, an uneducated widow who is ill-prepared for the challenges that they will confront in the United Nations. And she's really sidelined until the Soviets refused to concede defeat on a resolution that they insisted be adopted that would repatriate refugees to their countries of origin. And the boys, as she calls them, are focused totally on the Security Council issues. So when Wyszynski refuses to take no for an answer, and in the General Assembly, after weeks of debate in both Committee 3 and ECOSOC over the refugee repatriation issue, gives a gripping speech on the floor of the General Assembly. And Wyszynski was a master debater. I want you to think of James Earl Jones with Obama's eloquence. You know, he just got you. And Dulles realizes, and Austin realize, that nobody on the delegation is equipped to respond. And so Dulles goes to Eleanor and asks her if she would respond. She confers for 4 minutes with Durward Sandifer, an advisor, and she gives an unscripted, extemporaneous rebuttal to Wyszynski that even makes the front page of Pravda. I want you to think about that. The front page of Pravda. Dulles comes up to her as they are walking out of the auditorium, Assembly Hall, and says to her, "Mrs. Roosevelt, when you were appointed, I thought it was just terrible. But I must say, your work today has just been fine." And so that night, Eleanor writes Joe Lash, Truda's husband, and says, relays this story with that vocabulary. And she says, "So against the odds, women move forward, but I'm rather old to be carrying on this fight." But what happens is that the United Nations now see Eleanor in a new way. And to make a long story short, in May 1946, she is appointed to the 18-member Nuclear Commission, charged with coming up with some type of statement for the General Assembly on what human rights mean. Now this is what I would like you to hold in your minds and your hearts while we think about this. The only thing these 18 nations agree on is they beat the Germans and the Japanese. They don't agree on God. They don't agree on private property. They don't agree on the purpose of government. They don't agree on citizenship. I mean, that's just scratching the surface. And they go in the room, and 17 of those nations have already decided that Eleanor should be chair. The United States does not want her. They think that she's not capable of doing the job. And so there's intense little bickering behind the scenes of who could we get? Oh, well, let her just get through the nuclear commission. Let's just get it set up and we'll get somebody else to do it, when it's no longer a nuclear commission, but the commission itself is formalized and institutionalized and packed with serious thinkers and diplomats. So they, just over 2 weeks, they debate all the religions of the world that they represent. They debate what human nature is. They debate what a right means. They debate whether or not there can be a declaration. Is it international for governments, or is it universal for persons? And so they decide that they will form a drafting committee. And it's a 3-person drafting committee. And they unanimously ask Eleanor to chair the drafting committee. And on that, they appoint Hen Sung Chang. And, then there is an outcry. There are no Western people, there are no Soviets. There are no Latins. So Eleanor, on her own power, even without going to the committee, expands the drafting committee from 3 to 8. And in that, she includes representatives from Chile, from the Soviet Union, from the United Kingdom, from Australia, and Iran. And they spend the entire summer crafting a starting point that can be considered when the committee convenes in a formal way in Lake Success, New York, the following January. The first item of business is electing Eleanor Roosevelt its permanent chair. So within that, she has got to navigate social rights, economic rights, political rights, civil rights, cultural rights. She has to navigate the United States, which wants absolutely no part of social, economic, and cultural rights. She has to navigate a State Department which is beginning to have serious doubts over whether the United States should even participate in crafting a declaration. And she has to school lawyers in plain speaking. She says to them, we cannot spend 3 years debating on where to put a comma. That what the world needs now is a vision to withstand the horrors of Holocaust, the horrors of the bomb, their intractable fear of a return of a worldwide depression, and the likelihood that if we fail, there will be another world war sooner, in a shorter time span than between World War I and World War II. And so, with her ability to moderate intense philosophical differences, to deal, let's say, with some of the most pronounced male egos of the period, and her ability to moderate debate, and not immediately degenerate into name-calling and keeping people at the table, the commission moves forward. The commission almost dissolves several times during that period. And Eleanor is doing her own version of shuttle diplomacy. Over 18 months, there will be 300 formal, legal, diplomatic sessions on the Declaration that will cover more than 3,000 hours of debates. People will propose 310 amendments, 170 of which will be debated in the General Assembly itself after ECOSOC finally signs off on the declaration that has come out of committee. So how does she hold this committee together? She is not the brains of the committee. She is not the law. But this is the extraordinary energy and finesse that she had. The records are painstakingly clear that she not only had dozens and dozens of individual meetings with all of the delegates that were on the committee, but with their deputies, with their secretaries. And I don't mean secretariat secretaries, I mean people who did their work and transcribed their documents to make sure that they were clear. By the time the Universal Declaration of Human Rights will be presented to the General Assembly for a vote, Eleanor Roosevelt has had a one-on-one meeting with every member of the staff of the General Assembly and every single delegate. I want you to think about that. The custodial staff, the food staff, the carpool, the legal teams, the instructed delegates. Because she now is wedded to a committee, a declaration that can be understood and embraced. And she has gone literally to war with our State Department, diplomatic war with our State Department, to make sure it happens. After they begin working on the draft of the Declaration, we get a new Undersecretary of State in June 1947, whose name was John Lovett. And John Lovett wanted to, he saw no use for the Declaration. He thought it could be dangerous to the United States, and insisted that if in fact we had to do it, it should focus specifically on political and civil rights and not on economic, social, and cultural rights. And he begins to instruct delegates to vote against the work that they have already agreed to. Eleanor is incensed and writes him and says, quote, unquote, "I know full well the little value you place on human rights, but it is the fundamental issue of our time." When he refuses to engage, she goes above him to Secretary of State George Marshall and copies Harry Truman, and basically says that if the United States does not engage fully in the construction of the Declaration, that she will resign, and that she will release this correspondence to document her decision. And so Lovett is put under some check, not a lot, but under some check. All the while, she is continuing her outreach to the committee, who are embroiled in escalating Cold War politics, and is trying to get our delegation on board. And she will say over and over to individual delegates, nobody really does anything alone. We cannot take this on ourselves. It is only by including others to go along that change happens and work gets done. She tells them over and over that compromise is good as long as we compromise up. She is devastated, a word I use with precision, when the decision is made to go for a declaration rather than a legally binding covenant, although she certainly supports the decision because she believes that it will take decades to get the covenants adopted, and that the world now needs a vision to stand up to the horrors of Holocaust, poverty, and the war. She begins to say to people, courage is more exhilarating than fear. All we have to have is the courage to look in the mirror and take one step at a time. So she holds this fractious committee together, and she asks them to think as citizens of the world as much as citizens of the nations that they represent. So by the fall of 1948, there's a fragile consensus around a declaration. And now it is going to ECOSOC to be debated. And the battle with the State Department raises its head one more time. George Marshall asks Eleanor to give a major address in Paris before the final session where the declaration will be debated. She agrees. They pick a venue. She doesn't like that venue. She goes to Rene Cassin and gets the Sorbonne. They want to write the speech. She says, I'm going to give my own speech. So they write a speech. She takes roughly 2/3 of what they wrote out and inserts her own text and delivers the speech in French. And I have to tell you, if I could have seen one thing during this whole thing, I would have loved to have seen George Marshall sitting on the front row, like me, cannot speak a word of French. And here's Eleanor changing the whole speech, bringing all the references to the French Revolution and the Tea of Liberty and all of this expansive, powerful rhetoric into the speech, in which she says to the world, we are now on the forefront of debating the most fundamental issue of our time. What does freedom mean? And how are we to act as free people? So she said that's the backdrop. The final session of the debate of the Declaration takes 2 months, from September roughly to December 9th. They have 60 days. I just want you to think about the backdrop for this. The U.S. is divided politically. By the time that we're debating the Declaration, there are 4 major political parties running for president. Nobody expects Truman to win. Eleanor is convinced that if we can't get the Declaration by December, there will not be a declaration. So she holds 85 working sessions in 60 days. They start at 6:30 in the morning, and they go sometimes till 2 and 3 o'clock at night. They debate 170 amendments to try to sideline the Declaration. She launches a full-court press on every front in multiple arenas. She holds more than 100 individual meetings on top of the 85 meetings that she's in those 60 days. She goes on the radio. She speaks in multiple languages across Europe, Latin America, and the United States. She presses Marshall to drop his opposition to economic and social rights with, I might add, a stroke of genius. John Foster Dulles, who was an ardent Republican, who was the foreign policy advisor to the Republican candidate who almost beat FDR in 1944, and who was running in 1948. She appeals to his Catholicism and his commitment to his Jesuit faith to broker a compromise on economic and social rights. And Dulles and Eleanor tag team George Marshall to drop his opposition. And in unprecedented outreach that has never happened before or since, as an instructed delegate, as an employee of the United States State Department, Eleanor uses her daily syndicated My Day column to be a pundit on the importance of human rights, holding American negotiators responsible in print with the same intense conviction that she applies to the Soviets and the Belarusians and the Ukrainians and the Chileans who were involved in the process. Her column becomes so essential to the debate that papers across Europe print it. It is now printed in 36 of the 58 nations that are negotiating the Declaration of Human Rights. She says that she is tired of the pontificating language, that we need straight language, that we need straightforward language. She presses states to make a consensus. She vilifies and just goes after delegates from all of the big powers, us as well as the Soviets, as well as the British, as well as the Australians, who engage in what she calls attack and counterattack. She says, now a much larger pool of delegates is attempting to rewrite the vision that we have so painstakingly crafted. It will destroy it. Either we vote or it dies. So you know the rest of the story. But in the last 4 days of the debates of the delegation, Eleanor Roosevelt edits Archibald MacLeish's preamble to the Declaration in language that gets it through. She presses state repeatedly to commit seriously to negotiations on the conventions and to make them a priority. And she works with Hans Semeda to get women included in the preamble, and specifically included in Article 1, which ironically was the hardest of the 30 articles to craft. And as everybody in this room knows, I'm sure, Article 1 says, all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and in rights. They are endowed with reason and conscience and should treat one another in a spirit of brotherhood. Now, there are people in this room who know world history better than I will know it if I studied 5 lifetimes. But this is what I do know. Never in the history of the world had there been a sentence that included men, women, and children of all races, all nationalities, all creeds, all level of ability of having the same rights. So what lessons can we learn from this? As Eleanor would say, no one can make you feel inferior without your own consent. 4 years of school up against a Princeton law degree. 4 years of school up against Rene Cassin, one of the great philosophers of the post-war period. Self-taught, self-read. If you have a vision, stick to it. She would also say to us that laws are only as powerful as they are understood. So the purpose of law is to inspire and to educate and to embolden. That pushing the envelope as far as you can go is great. as long as it's done clearly, without arrogance, with as much consistent outreach as possible. That courage is more exhilarating than fear. That compromise is good as long as you compromise up. And that women must stand up in their own way to the forces of fear and retreat. And that passage is not the end of the story. The battle at the home front to promote the Declaration takes even more skills and more risks than the negotiating skills to craft the Declaration. There are 11 assassination attempts on Eleanor Roosevelt after the Declaration. She refuses Secret Service protection. The Ku Klux Klan places the largest bounty in its history on her head. J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the FBI, is so enraged by the potential of the Declaration to undercut the ethos of Jim Crow that he tries to convene a special meeting of the Senate Judiciary Committee to have Eleanor declared colored, to have her citizenship stripped because she is a secret communist, and to deport her to live with her people, the coloreds, in Liberia. She comes home and debates the American Bar Association, which is opposed to the covenant. She debates the Chamber of Commerce, opposed to the government. She has intense one-on-one meetings with Democratic leaders of the Senate and liberal Republican leaders of the Senate to try to forge consensus on it. She launches a nationwide lecture tour. She goes to 512 colleges from 1948 until her death in November 1962, working to speak on the importance of the Declaration. She raises money for grassroots organizations that are committed to the Declaration. She raises countless funds for the NAACP, Legal Defense and Education Fund, and the United Nations Association. She continues her daily column. She starts a question and answer column. She does radio shows that are questions and answers, and she writes 5 books on the importance of the United Nations and the Declaration. So, in conclusion, Eleanor's vision still stands. You know, it's included in more, the Declaration is included in more constitutions than the American Constitution and the U.S. Bill of Rights. It has been recognized in law, including the United States Supreme Court, but it is now under attack. So what do we know? We know that Eleanor and J.K. Rowling are spot on. And here on the grounds of Hogwarts, where you have Hermione and McGonagall and Dumbledore and even Ron trying to get engaged, and friends giving Harry the courage that he needs. After 30 years of research on Eleanor Roosevelt, more documents than I can possibly share with the world, I can say that without reservation, Eleanor Roosevelt would stand with Hermione. She would absolutely support the Society to the Protection of Elf Welfare, that she would oppose the Dark Lord with ingenuity, intelligence, tenacity, and joy, that she would even bring Ron into the fight, that she would continue to give Harry the courage to leave. And once the battle was won, she would dedicate her life to making sure that the dark side does not return. So I appreciate your attention very much, and I'll be happy to answer any questions you might have.